Hi. Over the last weeks and so, we put a lot of information together and tried to bring pieces of this puzzle together in a reasonable manner and trying to make it factual and not subject to the misinformation. And I think we've done a pretty good job of things. I'd like to just kind of bring it all to a little conclusion here and give you an idea of what I think based upon everything that we have presented and that we all know. First off, I don't think this was a process that was intentional. I don't even know if it was a process where there were bioweapons involved, although the fact that the military has control of that lab makes me just a little cautious on assuming that it's not at all possible. But what I believe happened is these BSL-4 labs are extremely complicated places to run. They can detect a pinhole in the mortar. Then they are subject to a lot of record keeping and alarms, and they thrive on a transparent dialogue between the people that are in the lab. If there is something that goes wrong, it's documented, it's known, it's determined what went wrong, and then procedures change so it doesn't happen again. And that's what makes these work. But even at that, the U.S. has been doing these labs for 40 years, and in 2018 there were still 11 incidents in the lab. Now, they were not releases of biologicals or anything, but they were just 11 little things that didn't go quite according to plan. So even under the best of circumstances, we can have that. China's a little different story because their track record on, maintenance, taking care of things, double checking, redundancy and whatever, and general, sloppiness in the lab and whatever are fairly well documented. And this is an area that we can't have those loose standards at all. What I think probably happened is that the French were there in 2015, built this lab, then they were kicked out, and maybe it ran fine for a while, but maybe then maintenance and various standards, that are normally kept up to snuff weren't. There were reports from the embassy that there were safety problems, from the U.S. embassy there were safety problems, and that there were a possibility of things happening there that maybe would not want to happen. So I think that in sometime after 2017 that a virus escaped from there, and it escaped by walking out of there having infected a lab worker. The reports from the U.S. Embassy said that they were understaffed, and sometimes that understaff includes maintenance and that. Now, to get this virus, it could be something as simple as just the seal on a face mask being not quite set right, and a person inhaling some virus particles. So it doesn't have to be clandestine. They're accidents, they do happen. I think this young lady encountered the virus. She walked out of there. She was okay for a few days, back and forth to work, and then she got a little sicker. And we know how rapidly this virus spreads. 1 in 6, one person contaminates 6. And I could imagine such a situation where she would be out feeling not quite good enough to go to work. Maybe she did go to work in spite of it, but then gradually getting worse and worse, but exposing to various people and whatever. Going to the hospital eventually, the doctors and care workers there being exposed, them not understanding what it is, maybe looks like flu, and she ends up dying, and maybe they just write that off as, an unfortunate bad case of the flu or something of that nature. Now, we know how this virus is secretive and how it can spread without people knowing it. We're reminded in New York City, where the Times reported that there was, when the first person showed up at the hospital, they figured there were 10,000 cases in the city. So translate that back to Wuhan, this virus builds up, this caseload in there, and no one's really aware of it. And then finally, this one doctor notices that there's something amiss here. There's more of these cases than should be, and rings the alarm bell. Well, that alarm bell has a difficulty there, and these BSL-4 labs and everything, the difficulty with China running them is their culture is not that open, transparent culture. Their culture is, don't point the finger at anybody, and I don't want the finger pointed at me because might get you shot out behind the barn somewhere. And plus the matter of saving face, it can't be responsible for this terrible thing that occurred, So there's a lot of negative ability there to hide these things and not want to have them disclosed, and it's a cultural and it's a regime type of a situation. So I could see people, scurrying to cover themselves on this, and when the first news comes out, and the lab probably sits there and says, oh my gosh, let's blame it on the wet market. The wet market says something else, and maybe at the local level they try to combat this and don't even let it known to the upper echelons because they don't want this punishment to come down on them, which allows this thing to gain this huge momentum. And when they finally do realize something is cooking in here, there's a great scrambling. And they attempt to cover this up as would be normal for that type of regime. And they go through all these processes of destroying the evidence and everything else involved to do that. But I think they miscalculated the massive tsunami that this thing was generating secretly. And by the time they had cases in Wuhan, I bet that was on the airplane, and I bet the world cities were already being seeded down at the time. So China made a big mistake. Had they jumped in there and admitted they had a leak in the lab, which would have, been hard on them for saving face because they've got this new lab and now they are incompetent and they blew it. So, but if they would have done that, we could have, help could have come sooner, could have come out later, and there would have been a lot fewer body bags. But they didn't, and those actions they did take had the effect of infecting the whole world, causing all the deaths, crash of the economy. And that is their fault. That is a product of their culture and their regime, and that is their fault. On our end, we had fault on our end in our response. We sat on our butts for 2 months, and we let this thing get ahead of us, and we're going to pay the price, and we're still paying the price. But I think that is kind of the sequence that this thing probably went. I don't think there was a big conspiracy. I don't think there was anything intentional. I think there was just some people who bit off more than they could chew with this BSL-4 lab and maintaining the standards necessary, and then they did not come clean with the world at an appropriate time to save the world all of this grief. So that's kind of the picture as I see it. I hope that jives with what you're thinking, but I think it's probably pretty logical. We'll talk some more about maybe the future, what we could do about this. Have a good day.